From ABC, this is World News Tonight, with Peter Jennings at the Foreign Desk in London, Max Robinson at the National Desk in Chicago, and from our desk in Washington, Frank Reynolds.
Good evening. There were new exchanges of harsh words today about the United States charge that North Korea fired a missile at an American plane 2 days ago. The North Koreans denied they tried to shoot down the plane and accused this country of trying to start a new war in Korea. The United States hurled the charge of international piracy at the North Koreans and offered new and fascinating information about Wednesday's incident. Pentagon correspondent John McWethy has the story.
Pentagon sources tell ABC News that the SR-71 spy plane used its super-secret electronics to project a false radar image of itself more than a mile from where the plane actually was. And sources believe it was that ghost image that the North Korean missile saw as its target when it detonated. The incident probably went like this. The pilot knew that a missile was after him when a warning light blinked on his dashboard, indicating that some airborne object had fixed a radar beam on his plane and was closing fast. At this point, the pilot flipped on a panel of electronic countermeasures, easily the most advanced such black boxes in the U.S. arsenal. Because of how it's designed, the aircraft is extremely difficult to spot on radar to begin with, and the SR-71 carries black boxes that allow the pilot to project multiple false images of the aircraft. It was one of these images that sources say the North Korean missile probably fixed on when it attacked. Pentagon officials refused all comment on the subject, indicating that too much has already been said about what this secret spy plane can or cannot do. John McWethy, ABC News, the Pentagon.
This is Barry Dunsmore. Secretary Haig did not repeat Secretary Weinberger's warning against new acts of international piracy, but at his news conference today, he did repeat the U.S. warning that flights of the SR-71 near North Korea would continue and would be adequately protected. He had some tough words for Cuba, too. Haig said the guerrillas in El Salvador are changing their tactics to what he called straight terrorism, and he blamed Cuba for the increased bloodshed there.
That issue is largely dependent on the activities of the external powers who continue their mischief inside El Salvador. Provision of armaments, command and control and direction, and possibly even advisory in certain guerrilla areas.
In suggesting the Cubans may actually have advisors in El Salvador, Haig seems to be laying the groundwork for certain measures the U.S. is threatening to take directly against Cuba.
Let me assure you, we're looking at a whole array of political, economic, and security-related measures that might be appropriate.
The reference to security-related measures the U.S. might take suggests something military. Officials here will not be specific, but it could, of course, include increased overflights of Cuba by the SR-71. Barry Dunsmore, ABC News, the State Department.
Still ahead, John Hinckley appears in court today and pleads not guilty to charges of trying to kill President Reagan. We'll have that story, as well as a report on how such Western items as blue jeans and rock records are sold quite outside the law in the Soviet Union, and the long and potentially lucrative inheritance battle over just who is a Hughes.
ABC's World News Tonight, brought to you by Budweiser.
He was brought to the courthouse here in Washington shortly after midnight. In court this morning, he spoke only 2 words: not guilty. John W. Hinckley, Jr., the man accused of shooting the president, gave that response after hearing the charges against him. We have a report from Susan King.
Security was unprecedented, more elaborate than any case in U.S. history. Marshals said they were determined to prevent what happened to Lee Harvey Oswald. In the courtroom for the first time, Hinckley's parents would hear the court charge their son with attempting to assassinate the President of the United States and assaulting 3 others. 26 years old, wearing glasses, a blue suit, and a bulletproof vest, John Hinckley stood and fidgeted as a 13-count indictment was read. But when Judge Barrington Parker asked Hinckley how he would plead, his voice was strong and loud. His answer, only 2 words: not guilty. But Hinckley's attorney, Vincent Fuller, said he was undecided about claiming the insanity defense. He requested 30 more days of psychiatric testing. Judge Parker granted the time. Fuller also relayed Hinckley's request to be released from jail on bond. That request will be heard by Judge Parker on Tuesday. When the half-hour arraignment ended, Hinckley stood to leave. His lawyers pointed out where his parents sat. Biting his lip, Hinckley turned to the back of the room for the first time and gave an awkward wave. John and Joanne Hinckley smiled briefly and then rushed out of the courthouse, trying to avoid reporters. At high noon, a noisy motorcade left the courthouse. Reporters were told Hinckley was inside. It was a decoy. Late today, Hinckley was helicoptered to the stockade of Fort Meade Army Base outside of Washington. Hinckley's plea today leaves a number of options: to change it to guilty and bargain for psychiatric care, or keep the not guilty plea but add by reason of insanity. Susan King, ABC News, Washington.
The insanity defense is one of the more controversial and perhaps misunderstood or mystifying principles of American law. Tonight, law correspondent Tim O'Brien has this special assignment report on the relationship between crime and a defendant's mental condition.
Would a sane man try this? To kill a public figure just because he was famous? A jury in Maryland said yes, rejecting Arthur Bremer's insanity defense, convicting him of attempted murder. Would a sane man kill 33 children and bury them in the basement of his home, as John Wayne Gacy did? A jury in Illinois said yes, rejecting Gacy's insanity defense, convicting him of murder. The Gacy and Bremer cases illustrate how difficult it can be to convince a jury that a criminal defendant ought not be held responsible for his actions, even when that defendant appears mentally disturbed. Veteran trial lawyer Louis Nizer.
The legal test is much more severe than the medical test. No matter what his motive was, did he know he was doing something wrong? Was he showing off to a girl, or was he trying to get prominent in history that his name would go down, or was he trying to practice revenge? If he was doing that, he's sane, even though, in legal contemplation, even though he's very abnormal.
The FBI believes John Hinckley shot President Reagan because he wanted to impress an actress whom he'd never even met. If so, that would certainly be abnormal, but it would not necessarily provide Hinckley an insanity defense. 3 days after the shooting, Hinckley was taken to this federal prison in North Carolina, where he underwent psychiatric exams to determine if he's even mentally competent to stand trial. Does he understand the charges against him? Can he assist in his own defense? Government psychiatrists reportedly have found that Hinckley is competent to stand trial. And even if found competent to stand trial, a defendant is still free to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, based on his mental state at the time of the crime. The test for legal insanity in Washington, D.C. is similar to that used in most federal courts. Hinckley could be acquitted if the jury concluded that, as a result of a mental disease or defect, he lacked substantial capacity to either appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of law. Roughly translated, that means to convict, prosecutors must prove that Hinckley had the will to do what he did, the knowledge that it was wrong, the choice to do otherwise. If the test seems vague, it was intended to be, and it does leave substantial discretion to the jury. Too much discretion if you ask Eugene Gold, the district attorney in Brooklyn, New York.
It is not uncommon for both sides to seek out a psychiatrist who will be more prone to the view that that particular side espouses. And then we say to a jury of 12 people who know precisely zero about psychiatry, you decide. It seems to me that's ridiculous.
Other critics, like New York psychiatrist Abraham Halpern, feel that absolving defendants of legal responsibility may ease the way for their premature return to society.
Technically speaking, an individual who is no longer mentally disordered will properly insist on discharge from the institution following his acquittal by reason of insanity.
Case in point, Edward Kemper was sent to a mental institution in 1964 after murdering his grandparents. Not guilty, but insane. In 1969, a judge found he no longer posed a threat to the community, and Kemper was released. In the next 4 years, Kemper murdered his mother and 7 other women. He was convicted of all 8 murders, and the jury refused to accept his insanity plea.
I think first, the insanity defense has no place in the criminal justice process. Neither lawyers, nor juries, nor judges are competent to deal with the subject.
The insanity defense, as we know it today, however controversial, is not about to go away. It is ingrained in American jurisprudence. Society ought not punish those whom it cannot blame. Tim O'Brien, ABC News, at Federal Court in Washington.
Dennis McNell died of liver failure and not from a beating. That was the conclusion of an autopsy performed after charges that McNell had been murdered. It was the allegation by McNell's two brothers of improper stock dealings that brought about the resignation of CIA official Max Hugel. And Christopher Cook, the Air Force lieutenant charged with passing Titan missile secrets to the Soviets, left McConnell Air Force Base in Kansas today and flew on to Fort Meade, Maryland for his trial, which is expected to begin next week.
Now, more on Edwin Wilson, the former CIA agent now in hiding in Libya, who was interviewed exclusively on this broadcast last night. Wilson is under indictment here on charges of smuggling explosives to Libya. There have also been charges that Wilson recruited Americans to go to Libya and train terrorists. Tonight, senior correspondent John Scali has a report on Wilson's last known contact with the government of the United States.
A top Justice Department official met secretly in Rome last month with the notorious fugitive Edwin Wilson, who's escaped arrest for the past 18 months. ABC News has learned that the mysterious meeting, reportedly instigated by Wilson, occurred July 10th, 11th, and 12th. E. Lawrence Barcella, the Justice Department attorney in charge of prosecuting the ex-CIA agent, flew to Rome after the Italian government agreed to allow Wilson into the country specifically for the meeting. Informed authorities indicate that Wilson offered some kind of deal promising to cooperate in exchange for undisclosed favors. Barcella is reported to have rejected the deal. It seems likely that Wilson went to Rome with the full knowledge of the Libyan government as well as the Italians. He was allowed to leave Rome without interference afterward, even though he is on the Interpol most wanted list. Wilson is now back in Libya. If and when he returns home, federal authorities will be waiting at the airport with what they believe is an ironclad case that will put him into jail for years. John Scali, ABC News, Washington.
The Justice Department said today that it is still working on the case of Walter Polovchak, the 13-year-old Ukrainian boy who ran away from his family last year while they were staying in Chicago. His parents have since returned to the Soviet Union, but are suing here for custody of the boy and for damages against immigration officials who granted him asylum. A Justice Department spokesman said today the government does not want Walter to be returned to the Soviet Union against his will and will soon file a brief on his behalf with the Illinois State Court handling the case. Peter?
Frank, in Moscow today, a 54-year-old Soviet engineer and his mother drove their battered car past startled Soviet guards and into the U.S. Embassy compound. Thereupon, for more than 3 hours, Vasily Nazarov discussed his personal problems with U.S. diplomats, trouble with his job, of his mother being beaten when she tried to intervene on his behalf. Then the engineer and his mother, who had not asked for any asylum, left. There was little further explanation. We have another report from the Soviet Union tonight. It is about a facet of Soviet life which has become, over the years, an entrenched part of the Soviet system. Here's our Moscow correspondent, Ann Garrels.
They wear Western blue jeans. They dance to Western rock and roll from Western sound systems. They sport T-shirts made in the USA. But since these items are not generally for sale in ordinary Soviet stores, where do Russians get them? For the Communist Party elite, there are special shops. Here, for instance, across from the Kremlin at the famous GUM department store, there is a closed section where a limited selection of Western goods is sold only to those with a special pass. And when Soviets lucky enough to travel abroad return home, their suitcases are packed with Western purchases, many of which end up on the black market. That's where ordinary people pay extraordinary sums for what their government can't or won't supply. The equivalent of $195 or a month's salary for a pair of Levi's. $50 to $100 for one Western record. $75 for Russian and English books published abroad and somehow smuggled in. Despite these prices, the demand is never-ending, and around any hotel or embassy where foreigners are to be found, there are always self-made Soviet businessmen anxious to buy whatever a visitor will part with. Yuri is a black marketeer. He says he can make over $200 a day reselling Western watches, tape recorders, and clothes.
Underground market, it is the very popular thing in the Soviet Union. But there are lots of police in civil clothes who are control the situation, and if they catch you with the clothes, They never take you to the police station. Simply take your clothes and then resell them.
Soviet newspapers regularly rail against the black market, but it just grows bigger and bigger. Everyone, it seems, has a contact. Everyone, it seems, is dealing on the black market. It's now become the Soviet way of life. Ann Garrels, ABC News, Moscow.
One other note from the Soviet Union, it appears there will be another poor grain harvest. The Soviet agricultural expert says, with luck, it might reach 200 million tons this year, 40 million tons below the target. Bad weather and bad organization are the perennial problems. A modest assist for the Polish economy. Poland and the United States have agreed to defer most of Poland's long-term loan payments, which were due this year. Almost $400 million in payments have been put off for between 5 and 8 years. In southern Africa tonight, the highly controversial South African raids into Angola appear to be winding down. Whether the fighting is completely over remains in question. The South African Military Command says its invasion force is already returning to bases in southwest Africa, also called Namibia. Angola says that announcement is purely a diversion. South Africa's military commanders, who've called the invasion a limited task, say that many guerrillas from the Southwest Africa People's Organization have been killed and huge quantities of their equipment destroyed. And finally, from overseas, for the third time in 10 days, the world record for the mile has changed hands. Once again, it belongs to the Englishman Sebastian Coe. He knocked more than a second off Steve Ovette's run of Wednesday. In Brussels tonight, Coe ran 3:47.3 seconds, and that historic rivalry continues.
The Agriculture Department now has underway a large-scale operation to make sure that beef shipped from Australia is just that, beef, and not horse meat or kangaroo meat. Australian officials said today they now know who was responsible for shipping the stuff to this country, and charges will be filed. For more on what is being done about it in this country, here is Bettina Gregory.
The Agriculture Department has impounded 66 million pounds of Australian beef from warehouses like this one in California. All further imports of Australian beef are banned until government scientists analyze the, quote, beef, using test animals, to make sure it isn't kangaroo or horse meat. That's because a major shipment of Australian beef destined for hamburgers, hot dogs, and luncheon meat was found to include horse and kangaroo meat. News of the biggest meat scandal in years sent the price of beef skyrocketing on the Chicago Commodities Exchange. Retail prices were up 20 cents a pound yesterday, and the Agriculture Department has gone into a regulatory tailspin.
We are going to initiate stronger controls to be sure that we do routine testing, we do oversight testing, and we're going to have to redouble our efforts to make sure this doesn't happen.
Until the investigation is complete, the government won't tell us which fast food chains buy Australian beef. ABC News contacted a number of them today. None of them would admit to using it. Bettina Gregory, ABC News, Washington.
Some new hope today of getting more pictures of Saturn despite Voyager 2's malfunctioning camera platform. Scientists are trying to turn the entire spacecraft around to aim the cameras back at Saturn for more shots like these. Pictures taken before the problems developed and just released today. Voyager 2 itself continues to speed away from Saturn and out into deep space toward Uranus. On the west coast, Los Angeles is in the middle of the worst heat wave of the century. And that heat, combined with the classic Los Angeles smog, is creating even more serious problems. Royal Kennedy reports.
Hot and dirty. That was the only way to describe the blanket of air which stifled the Los Angeles basin today. Pollution levels were so high, officials predicted second-stage smog alerts for 5 separate areas, forcing drivers into carpools and easing freeway traffic. The smog was made even worse by the record heat wave. This was the 78th straight day of temperatures above 80 degrees, a record for this century. By midday, temperatures were approaching and threatening to pass the 100-degree mark. Area power plants struggled to meet record demands for electricity as Southern Californians rushed to buy fans. Those who did venture outside seemed intent on taking it easy. Parks and playgrounds were empty. Baseball diamonds deserted, as kids found a cooler way to survive the dog days of August. Royal Kennedy, ABC News, Los Angeles.
Finally tonight, a story about a tree of sorts. To lawyers in a Texas courtroom, it's a family tree. To their clients, who may or may not be related to Howard Hughes, it's a money tree. Charles Murphy reports from Houston.
Howard Hughes rests in peace in a Houston cemetery where cousins on his mother's side buried him. These cousins will get half his money, but the battle for the other half has just begun, and it's already getting nasty. On one side are a handful of first cousins once removed. On the other, hundreds of second cousins and distant kin. Some have the Hughes look, all right. Listen, you do look a lot like Howard.
Yeah. When I was real young, I looked more like Howard then than I do now.
They have another ploy. Howard's only first cousin was Elspeth Hughes, who is dead.
Questions are being raised here about Elspeth's legitimacy. Agnes was her mother, but was Rupert, Howard's uncle, really Elspeth's father?
Uncle Rupert, a playwright and screen director, sued for divorce in 1903, charging Agnes with adultery with at least 8 men.
She was apparently a real pretty blonde gal who attracted men like honey does flies.
Uncle Rupert got the divorce and little Elspeth. A genealogist claims another man fathered Elspeth because Uncle Rupert was left sterile by the mumps.
How can Rupert have a baby when he has no access to Agnes? How can he have a baby when he is sterile and he was with 5 women? He could never have any children by them, but yet they had children by other men.
Elspeth's children are outraged, but are letting lawyers speak for them.
I think the challenge is without any foundation, and I think that as we get into it, everyone's going to see it's almost humorous, is what I think of it.
The case could last a month, and the spicy part begins next week. Was Aunt Agnes unfaithful? Was Uncle Rupert sterile? Is this the true Hughes bloodline? Stay tuned, folks. Charles Murphy, ABC News, Houston.
Thank you, Charlie. Once again, tonight's top story. North Korea today denied it fired a missile at an American plane last Wednesday and accused the United States of trying to start a new war in Korea. This country accused North Korea of international piracy and said reconnaissance flights in the area will continue. That's our report for now on World News Tonight. This is Frank Reynolds in Washington. For ABC News, good night.